Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another long-awaited episode in my serial killer spotlight series. I kinda put this series to rest towards the beginning of this year because in all honesty these videos are a lot of work and I don't feel like they're quite as important as my mystery series or my history series. I mean, why spend so much time focusing on a serial killer when I could put that time into focusing on a victim or educating people, you know? So I decided that I'd only do these serial killer cases when I had some extra time to focus on them or when a name repeatedly pops up in my other videos. When talking about serial killers as potential suspects in my other videos, I do like to have a full video on that person that I can refer people to in case they would like more information. And this week's focus, the Hillside Stranglers, have come up in about 3 different videos in the past couple of months, so I figured it's about time. Let's learn about the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. Their crime spree would be a short but devastating one, with 10 young women between the ages of 12 and 28 being killed via strangulation in the hills of Los Angeles between October 1977 and February 1978, and then 2 more just by Bianchi after that. Yep, that's right, another serial killer in California in the 1970s. Public awareness of these crimes began around the 17th of October 1977, when the naked body of a woman was found on a hillside near the Ventura Freeway, on the edge of Forest Lawn Cemetery, hence the later nickname the Hillside Stranglers. All victims would be found on hillsides in a similar state, and all the victims had been killed elsewhere. A man called Frank Salerno was called to the scene, and he was a detective who was also very closely involved in the Night Stalker case, Richard Ramirez. And investigators soon realised that this woman had been intensely cleaned by whoever had killed her. And immediately the crime struck investigators as really weird. Whoever had done this had gone to no effort to hide her body. It was placed almost as if they wanted it to be found and they knew what they were doing. There wasn't a single piece of forensic evidence in sight. This would be the beginning of a number of bodies and a chase that would last just over a year, until the perpetrators were finally identified in early 1979. All the women were strangled and all were sexually assaulted. At first, investigators were on the lookout for just one assailant, some man abducting women off the streets, but it soon became clear to investigators that there was no way that just one person was able to do this on their own. It was clear that some of the bodies had literally been thrown out of a moving car, and that's not really possible for just one person to do. No, they were looking for 2 perpetrators, although they didn't make that known to the public right away. These 2 would turn out to be cousins, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. As always, we'll begin with a look into the killer's childhoods. As we know, all too often there are clues as to who they are to become in a child's formative years. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi was born on the 22nd of May 1951 in Rochester, New York, to a 15-year-old girl who wasn't exactly in the best situation in life. Most sources describe her as an alcoholic sex worker, like that's all there was to her. She was clearly in no position to raise a child, so she does the best thing she can do and puts her son up for adoption. 3 months later, he was adopted by Nicholas and Frances Bianchi, and he was raised by them as an only child. Frances would later say that it was clear from the time Kenneth could talk that he was a compulsive liar, and he was never the easiest child. When he was 3.5 years old, Frances took him to the hospital, saying that her son just didn't sleep, and he was wetting the bed on a regular basis. Although this might be slightly too young to be considered a true problem, a lot of 3.5-year-olds still probably do wet the bed, and it's probably normal for them to have accidents in the night. It is interesting, as bedwetting is one of the 3 factors in the McDonald Triad. The McDonald Triad says that the presence of any 2 factors are predictive of violent tendencies as an adult, and these are bedwetting, animal cruelty, and setting fires. Whilst Kenneth was still young at this point when he was first taken to hospital, by the age of 7 he was actually checked by the doctors for urinary dribbling. As well as the age of 9, he was having involuntary urination for which his mother made him wear sanitary pads. From the age of 5, it's reported that Kenneth would start to experience frequent lapses into trance-like states of daydreaming, where his eyes would roll back into his head and he becomes completely inattentive. Francis takes him back to the doctor again and he's diagnosed with petit mal seizures or absent seizures. She was told that eventually he would just grow out of them, which I assume eventually he did. That same year he was also said to have fallen off a jungle gym at school and got an injury to his face. Could it be that he sustained a possible head injury as well? That's another common thing you see in serial killers. At the age of 11, Kenneth has to move schools twice because he just can't get along with his teachers, and he's said to be lazy, inattentive and angry with a very quick temper. Although he was found to have a higher than average IQ, he never quite applied himself and this frustrated his teachers. Then 2 years later, at the age of 13, Kenneth's father suddenly dies and he refuses to show any signs of grief or loss. He was actually diagnosed by a therapist at one point with passive-aggressive personality disorder, which according to WebMD is characterised by resentment and opposition to the demands of others, procrastination and intentional mistakes in response to others' demands, cynical, sullen or hostile attitude, and frequent complaints about feeling underappreciated or cheated. Nowadays, this isn't considered to be a distinct mental illness in itself, but instead being passive-aggressive is a feature of other personality disorders. But it seems that eventually Kenneth did start to get his life together a little bit. It's said that from the age of around 15 he started to date frequently, he was very clean cut and very respectful of his elders. At the age of 18, it seems he proposed to a woman called Susan who turned him down, so instead he proposes to his high school sweetheart, Brenda Beck, and she says yes. The two are only married for a few months in the end, as it soon becomes clear that Brenda doesn't meet Kenneth's idea of what a woman should be, and he just can't seem to stay faithful. After the end of their marriage, he decides that he wants to become a police officer, so he enrolls at Monroe Community College and then gets married again at the age of 20, but 8 months later his wife leaves him again. It's around this time that the Alphabet murders happen in Rochester, so from 1971 to 1972. 3 young girls aged 10 and 11 with double initial names get murdered and their bodies were left in dump sites around the outskirts of the city. Bianchi would later be considered a very strong suspect, but he's always denied any involvement in this case. I will link my full video on the Alphabet murders down below, just in case anybody wants to go and learn more about that. Kenneth ends up dropping out of college when he just doesn't do very well. He's not able to follow his dreams of becoming a police officer and instead ends up working in security at a jewellery store. But soon, employees start to notice that things are going missing. It was Kenneth, of course, stealing items of jewellery to give to girlfriends and sex workers just to keep them on his side. He eventually lost that job, so he got another, and the same thing happened again and again. And Kenneth soon realised that Rochester wasn't the place for him. At the age of 26, he heads to the other side of the country to California to live with his older cousin, Angelo Buono. Angelo was 17 years older and Kenneth had always somewhat idolised him, but Angelo, as it turns out, was not a good person to idolise. Angelo Anthony Buono Jr. was born on the 5th of October 1934, also in Rochester, New York, to first-generation Italian immigrant parents. 5 years later, his parents divorced and Angelo moves to Glendale, California with his mum Jenny and his sister. Jenny supported her children by working in a shoe factory, and Angelo was raised as Catholic, but like loosely Catholic. He was never all that religious. It doesn't seem like there's anywhere near as much information online about Angelo's childhood years as there was about Kenneth's, so I can't tell you too much about what he was like as a kid, but I can tell you what he was like as a teenager, and none of it was any good. Angelo was never bothered about his education, he just didn't care, and therefore he just didn't really have one. He never bothered with school at all. By 14 years old, he was openly idolising a man called Carol Chessman, a notorious rapist who was also known as the Red Light Bandit. And Angelo says that he thinks Chessman should have done more than just sexually assault his victims. He would just openly make comments like that to his friends. As is so often the case, Buono had a complicated relationship with his mother, it seems, and he would remain sort of emotionally tied to her for the rest of his life, but he would call her a whore to her face really often. He would brag to friends about raping and sodomizing girls, and he was barely a teenager at this point. So it's no surprise when he starts getting in trouble with the law. By the age of 16, he'd dropped out of school entirely and was arrested for larceny several times. He was sent to a reform school for boys after he was convicted of Grand Theft Auto, but he actually escaped this school several times. By the age of 21, he got a 17-year-old girl pregnant, and he marries her, only to leave her a week later. In January 1956, his first child, Michael, is born, but he refuses to pay child support, refuses to have anything to do with the baby, and refuses to let Michael even call him dad. A year later, he gets another girlfriend pregnant and has another son, Angelo Anthony Buono III. They end up marrying soon after, and over the next few years she has 3 more sons by him, Peter, Danny and Louis, and then a daughter called Grace. 2 years later, Mary, his wife, filed for divorce because of how badly he treated her. She said he was constantly calling her awful names, similar to how he did with his mother. He was violent, he was regularly arrested, and had perverse sexual needs that she just wasn't interested in. And sources say that he would often rape her and beat her in front of their children. After the divorce was final, Angelo seemed to successfully be able to avoid paying any child support whatsoever, and Mary was forced to go on welfare to feed their children. In an attempt to perhaps be able to provide, she actually goes to visit Angelo in an attempt to reconcile, but he handcuffed her, shoved a gun into her stomach, and threatened to kill her, and she didn't try again after that. He was just a complete deadbeat dad. He wanted nothing to do with his children, he didn't want to pay anything, and he had 6 of them. The very next year, Angelo moves in with Nanette Campina, an unassuming 25-year-old single mother of 2 children, and he treats her the exact same way that he treated Mary. She was actually scared to leave him for fear of repercussions, so she just stayed in this abusive relationship. In 1967, Angelo was arrested for stealing cars and is sentenced to 1 year in prison, but because of his large family that he needs to support, he gets his sentence suspended so he could work, despite the fact that he wasn't paying any of them any child support. In that same year, Nanette actually gets pregnant by him and gives birth to his 7th child, Tony, and a couple of years later another son called Sam. In 1971, Angelo starts abusing Nanette's 14-year-old daughter and brags to his friends about raping her. And it was at that point that Nanette decides that enough is enough. She takes all of her children and leaves the state. She doesn't just move out, she leaves the entire state to get away from this man. Then he marries a woman called Deborah Taylor on a whim, but he never actually lives with her, probably luckily for her. And the two just remain married, I think, for the rest of his life. By this point, he's 38 years old, and roommates would later say that he exhibited disturbing behaviour around this time, admitting to more and more obscene things that honestly I don't even want to repeat, so I shan't. We don't need to know all the horrible, gory details. In 1975, he opens up an auto upholstering shop and soon has a reputation as being pretty good at his job. But unknown to the public, he would use his own space here for his perverted needs. He gets a reputation in the neighbourhood as being an Italian stallion, a bit of a flirt and just great with the ladies. Despite his perversions, young girls were actually very attracted to him, and he had a new woman every single week. And by girls, I mean teenagers. He knew exactly how to give teenage girls the attention they so craved. He could easily manipulate teenagers into giving in to his sexual demands and convince them that it was normal. It was at the end of this year that cousin Kenny turns up in town, and Kenneth is still obsessed with just how cool his older cousin is, how he's able to attract so many girls, and the two move in together. This would turn out to be a deadly combination. Angelo is perverted to his core, and Kenneth is eager to please, whilst also having a negative view of women. Once in Los Angeles, Kenneth decides to continue on his quest, his dream to become a police officer, and in the space of just a few months applies to the Los Angeles Police Reserves, the Glendale Police Department and the Los Angeles Police Department, but is rejected from all. He eventually moves out of the apartment that him and Angelo share and moves in with his girlfriend, Kelly Boyd, who he'd met at work at the California Land Title Company. Because whilst he couldn't get into the police, he had to have another job, of course. But he didn't like his job. He didn't like working that much at all. Actually, he purchases a fake psychology degree and credentials and starts to rent a space where he pretends to be a psychologist. Luckily, very few people actually go to see him. Imagine later having to say that your psychologist turned out to be a serial killer. You'd need much more therapy after that. He starts to fake having cancer so he can skip work, and eventually does get fired when marijuana is discovered in his desk drawer. Angelo, of course, ran his auto upholstery shop throughout this entire time, but neither of the men particularly wanted to have to work for a living. They were just lazy. They wanted to live the life without having to lift a finger. So one day they, or actually I think it was Angelo specifically, come up with an idea. They want to become pimps. They want to get young women to work for them as sex workers and pocket the money. Kenneth had the charm to recruit the girls, and Angelo had a lot of connections in the sex work world, so he could get customers through that. They thought this was going to be easy, and I suppose at the very beginning it kind of was for them. Somehow they're able to charm two teenage runaways called Sabra Hannon and Becky Spears into working for them, and under Kenneth and Angelo's control, they were forced to sell themselves or be subject to severe physical punishments, rape and beatings. Sabra and Becky were basically held prisoner by the cousins. Eventually, after somehow being able to contact a lawyer, Becky was able to escape the situation and Sabra soon followed, leaving the state entirely and refusing to return out of fear until she'd heard they'd been arrested. It was no shock to either of these girls when they found what these men had really been up to. But undeterred with Becky and Sabra escaping, Angelo and Kenneth decide to set out to find more girls they could pimp out. In their search, they met a woman called Deborah Noble, who said that she had a trick list, a list of names of men in the area who frequented sex workers. This was exactly what Bianchi and Buono needed to get their business off the ground. And in October 1977, Deborah and her friend Yolanda Washington delivered this list to Angelo for a price. Yolanda makes small talk with him, saying that she always worked on a certain stretch of Sunset Boulevard. It didn't take long until Angelo and Kenneth realised that the list they'd been provided with was a fake, and they were furious. They're going to make someone pay, and first they set out to find Deborah, but when they can't find her, Yolanda is the next obvious victim, and they knew exactly where she worked on Sunset Boulevard. What happened next would ignite something in these two men, and Yolanda would sadly be the first victim of many over the coming months. When 19-year-old Yolanda's body was discovered in mid-October 1977 on the hillside near the Ventura Freeway, as I mentioned in the opening of this video, she was tied with fabric around her neck, wrists and legs. Sources aren't entirely clear as to whether the fabric was still there when she was found or if it was just ligature marks, and some sources say it was rope instead. But what was clear was that Yolanda had been violently raped and beaten before being strangled to death, and then the body had been washed to remove any evidence. After investigation, it was discovered that the last person to see Yolanda alive was a music store owner called Ronald Lemieux. I assume Ronald owned a store on or at least overlooking Sunset Boulevard. as he later testified that he'd seen two men flash police badges at Yolanda before handcuffing her and forcing her into the back of what he assumed at the time to be an unmarked police car, but of course it wasn't. Investigators were quick to determine that Yolanda hadn't actually been arrested. Whoever did this had been posing as police, and I assume that Yolanda didn't recognise Buono and Bianchi at the time. She'd only had one very brief conversation with them. This would be the pair's MO for the majority of the rest of their crimes, it seems. Posing as undercover cops was a very easy way to lure unsuspecting women into their car, but at least the police were onto this from fairly early on. Although not that that would stop them from doing it multiple more times, because the next body was found less than 2 weeks later. Judith Miller was a 15-year-old student at Hollywood High School, and like Yolanda, Judith was a sex worker on Sunset Boulevard, and she was also working when approached by Bianchi and Buono, who obviously just flashed their police badge at her. It must have just been easy for them to approach sex workers because what they were doing, sex workers, was illegal, so getting caught by the police is just kind of an occupational hazard. It was probably easier for these women just to comply with what the police wanted. It was the 1st of November 1977 when police were called to a middle-class neighbourhood in La Crescenta, Alta Terrace Drive. The body of a teenage girl, who would later turn out to be Judith, had been found naked and face down on a parkway just outside a house. Again, her body wasn't hidden, it was left in plain sight, it was intended to be found. The house owner who first discovered her body covered her up with a tarp early that morning to ensure that the children on their way to school didn't see a dead body. But other than that, she just left her body undisturbed until the police arrived. Judith had bruises on her neck indicating strangulation as the cause of death, as well as ligature marks on both wrists, ankles and neck. The only piece of forensic evidence found on the body was a small piece of light-coloured fluff found on her eyelid. Like Yolanda, Judith had also been raped, and the coroner determined that she'd been strangled around midnight, so about 6 hours or so before she was found. It didn't seem like she'd been killed in the spot where she was found either, and the fact that there were no drag marks indicated that her body hadn't been pulled to the position. She probably wasn't killed nearby, and investigators theorised that she was carried from a car, possibly by more than one person. This theory would later turn out to be right. Not a single victim was killed in the spot they were found. They were all killed at Buono's upholstery shop. Although investigators didn't make it public knowledge, they suspected from very early on that there were two killers working together here. But of course they wouldn't even realise they had a serial killer, that both Yolanda and Judith were the victims of the same killer, for a while. Not as long as it took in other cases, but definitely a week or so. Neither of them were even identified for quite a while. Their details were shared in the local papers, but it took a while for people to come forward and say that their loved ones were missing. Judith was identified when Sergeant Frank Salerno took to the streets of Hollywood Boulevard and showed photos of Judith to literally hundreds of people, and soon the name Judy Miller started to pop up again and again, and eventually her family came forward to confirm. A man called Marcus Camden may have been one of the last people to see Judith alive, saying that he saw her leave the fish and chip restaurant about 9 p.m. on the evening before she was found. Someone else also saw her talking to a man driving a large two-tone sedan on Sunset Boulevard. We now know that she was picked up by Bianchi and Buono and was taken to Buono's auto upholstery shop, where she would be murdered, tortured and murdered. Perhaps one of the smartest and most stupid things that Bianchi and Buono did as serial killers was commit their crimes in such fast fashion. Investigators would barely have time to begin looking into one case before the next one popped up, and I can imagine they found themselves very overwhelmed very quickly. It was just 5 days after the discovery of Judith that the next victim would be found on the 6th of November 1977. Lissa Castin was found on a highway embankment near the Chevy Chase Country Club in Glendale. Just like Judith and Yolanda, she had ligature marks in all the same places. She'd been strangled and raped. 21-year-old Lissa, full name Alyssa, was a dancer and waitress who worked in North Hollywood. She was a performer with the LA Knockers, who were a popular female cabaret dance ensemble. She was the first victim who was not a sex worker, which is interesting because she likely would have been much more hesitant to get in a car with two strange men, even if they did identify themselves as police officers. Although it is worth noting that one article says that she'd made a comment to her mother that she was thinking about turning to sex work to make some extra money, but we don't know for sure if she ever actually did take that step. Nor was she a drug user or a runaway. Most articles describe Lissa as a characteristically good girl, somebody who played by the rules. It was only after Lissa's body was found that Sergeant Frank Salerno began to make connections between the victims. As soon as he saw her body, he made the link back to both Judith and Yolanda, and again he was pretty certain that two men were involved. There was quite a sizable guardrail on the side of the road, and for Lissa to be found where she was, she would have had to have been lifted over said guardrail. Salerno suspected that it would take two men to lift her. She was a professional dancer and as a result was pretty muscular and heavy. It would either take one incredibly strong man or two regular men. That, combined with the fact that people had seen Yolanda talking to two men, pushed him further towards that theory. Lissa was last seen leaving the restaurant where she worked called Health Fair near Hollywood and Vine. It would later transpire that around this time, one woman had a very lucky escape from becoming the next Strangler victim. At some point in early November, a 24-year-old woman called Catherine Law Baker was approached by Bianchi and Buono, who as usual flashed her their fake police officer badges. She handed over her ID in her wallet, as you do when you're approached by the police, and whilst flicking through they found a photo of Catherine sitting on her father's lap. Her father just so happened to be actor Peter Law. Her father had died 13 years previously, but he was a big name at the time, big enough that Bianchi and Buono recognised him, and quickly realised that killing the daughter of a celebrity probably wasn't the best move for them. It would attract way too much attention, so they simply let Catherine go. She had a very lucky escape. 28-year-old Evelyn Jane King, just known as Jane to everyone, sadly didn't. She was an aspiring actress and was apparently closely linked to LA's punk community, who went missing on November 9th. She wouldn't be found for quite a while, and in that time, two more girls would go missing as well, Dolores Dolly Cepeda and Sonia Johnson. They were just 12 and 14 years old respectively, and would be the youngest victims of the Hillside Strangler. The two girls attended St. Ignatius School together and were last seen getting off the bus on the 13th of November on York Boulevard and North Avenue 46, after they'd just come from shopping at Eagle Rock Plaza. Almost immediately after getting off the bus, they were seen walking over to a large two-tone sedan to talk to somebody on the passenger side of the car. Again, for them to be chatting to a passenger and not a driver suggested that there were two people involved here. And then the girls just disappeared. They would be found a week later by a 9-year-old boy who was treasure hunting in a rubbish heap on the hillside not far from the Dodger Stadium, and their bodies had already started to decompose. Just like the rest of the victims, it was determined that Dolly and Sonia had been strangled and raped. It turns out that Bianchi and Buono had watched Sonia and Dolly get on the bus that day and on a whim decided to follow them. Could they really abduct two girls at the same time? They saw it as a challenge. Unbeknownst to Bianchi and Buono, the girls had actually been at the plaza that day, stealing about $100 worth of costume jewellery from a shop. So when they were approached by two men pretending to be police officers, they were immediately going to cooperate, scared that they were going to get into more trouble. Bianchi told them that there was a burglar on the loose in the neighbourhood and that they wanted to offer them a ride home to ensure they stayed safe. And of course, the girls accepted. The same day the girls' bodies were discovered, the body of 20-year-old Christina Weckler had also just been found. She was an honours student at the Art Centre College of Design and was said to be a loving and serious young woman who should have had a very bright future ahead of her. She had disappeared and been discovered in the same day and was found just like the rest, with ligature marks on her wrists, ankles and neck, and was discovered on a hillside between Glendale and Eagle Rock. It seems that her death was slightly different than the others, with Kenneth Bianchi later testifying that he and Buono asphyxiated Christina by putting a plastic bag over her head, then putting a gas pipe inside the bag. As we'll cover later in the video, at trial Bianchi actually said he had very little memory of any of the killings, but he seemed to remember this in detail. I would take the details even provided by him with a pinch of salt though, because any sources I could find coming from investigators stated that Christina had been strangled just like the rest, but then again strangulation and asphyxiation are fairly similar. But there was undeniably one different detail about Christina's death. Her body was found with puncture marks on her arm, but there was no evidence suggesting that she was a drug addict. It later transpired that for reasons still unknown, Bianchi and Buono had injected her with Windex, the glass cleaner. They were just experimenting on her body. Christina Weckler wasn't completely unknown to Bianchi, it seems, and she was their first targeted abduction. Usually they just picked up random women they came across whilst trolling the streets, but Christina used to actually be a neighbour of Bianchi and may have spurned his advances at one point, and he took it personally. He never got over it. A few days before the abduction, Bianchi called Christina's home anonymously, presumably to make sure she still lived there. He told her on the phone that he'd like to eat her underwear, whilst Buono just egged him on. A few days later, on a Saturday night, they turned up at Christina's house. Buono waited in the car whilst Bianchi went up to her front door. He asked her if she remembered him, saying that he was now a member of the police reserve, and flashed her his badge. He tells her that he was patrolling her street and he noticed that somebody crashed into her car. Would she like to come out and see it, and he'll help her write a report? Not thinking anything of it, she agrees to do just that, and then she's bundled into their car and taken. 3 days later, Jane King's body was finally found close to the Los Feliz off-ramp on the Golden State Freeway. It was determined that Jane had been strangled, but because her body was in such bad condition, it was unable to be determined whether or not she'd been raped or tortured like the rest. In case you haven't been keeping track, Jane was the 7th victim in just over a month, unprecedented numbers for a serial killer. Yolanda Washington was found on the 17th of October and now it was the 23rd of November. All of this had happened in just over 4 weeks. It was only after the discovery of Jane's body that the local authorities decided to form a task force. 30 officers from the LAPD, the Sheriff's Department and the Glendale Police Department, all working together. The media had really started to pick up on the story around the deaths of Sonia and Dolly. Of course, 12 and 14-year-old girls go missing is going to be a huge story, and from there they ran with it. They dubbed the killer the Hillside Strangler. Only of course the detectives knew something the media didn't. They were looking for 2 people. And as so happens when a task force is created, they suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with worthless tips from the well-meaning public, adding more confusion to an already very complicated case. After the death of Christina, it seems Bianchi and Buono took over a week off, the longest break in killings since the murder of Yolanda Washington. But on the 29th of November, the body of 18-year-old Lauren Wagner was found. She was found in Glendale's Mount Washington area, just partially lying in the street. As with the rest, she was found with ligature marks on her ankles, wrists and neck, and sources described her as severely tortured. But just like the puncture marks found in the arm of Christina Weckler, there was also something different with Lauren's body. There were said to be electrical burns on the palms of her hands. As the murders went on, it was clear that each body had gone through increasingly sadistic levels of torture. Lauren lived with her parents in the San Fernando Valley and she'd gone out the night before. She was a good kid and her parents just went to bed expecting that Lauren would arrive home before midnight as she always did, but she didn't. When they woke up in the morning, they found that Lauren wasn't in her bed, but her car was parked across the street with the door ajar. Lauren's father called around some neighbours to ask if anyone had seen anything, and it turns out that one neighbour who owned the house that Lauren's car was found parked outside had indeed seen something. She'd seen Lauren get abducted. It was about 9 p.m. when Lauren pulled up home, and the neighbour watched as two men pulled their car up beside hers. There was some sort of loud disagreement before Lauren ended up in the car with these two men. The neighbour stated that one of the men was tall and young, the other was older and shorter with bushy hair. And she also said she heard Lauren cry out, "You won't get away with this." The car was large and dark with a white top, and we can assume that Bianchi and Buono pulled their usual trick of flashing their fake LAPD badges and identifying themselves as undercover police officers. Why the neighbour didn't intervene at the time or even call the police, I'm not too sure. It seems she didn't realise that Lauren had actually been abducted. She just thought she'd had an argument with friends and didn't even realise it was Lauren at the time. But she didn't even share what she'd seen with her husband, who was at home at the time. One article written by Marilyn Bardsley states that shortly before an officer came to talk to the neighbour that morning, she'd gotten a phone call from a man with a New York accent. He asked her, "You the lady with the dog?" She was. She had a Doberman, who I assume was barking and making noise throughout the abduction. The man on the phone told her to keep her mouth shut about what she'd witnessed or he would kill her. Whilst the neighbour claimed that she was standing inside the house and saw what happened out the window, this would have been a good 30 foot away. Investigators suspected that she wasn't being entirely truthful, that maybe she was even in the front garden and hid away during the encounter. Maybe she did realise it was something more serious than a quarrel but was too scared to say anything. Apparently the whole ordeal sent her into a violent asthma attack. If the abductors were concerned enough to find her number and actually call her to threaten her, perhaps they even realised that she was out the front of the house at the time. The abduction of Lauren Wagner sent the whole city into a panic. This happened in a middle-class neighbourhood. She was a good, law-abiding citizen. The general consensus was that if it could happen at the front of your house, this could happen to anyone. Because of course most people, investigators included a lot of the time, don't take the murders of sex workers seriously. They deserve it for having a high-risk lifestyle. And whilst many of the previous abductions and murders hadn't been sex workers either, Lauren was abducted out the front of her house. She was just coming home. It was too close for comfort for the people of Los Angeles. These killers had no specific hunting ground, no specific road or area that women should steer clear of. Any woman was at risk, and so came the standard warning. Don't go out alone at night and don't stop for the police unless you're in a safe place to do so. A spokesman for the Los Angeles Police Department at the time said, "In 27 years on the force, 13 of them on this job, I've never seen such a reaction of fear. All across the city, women were buying weapons and enrolling in self-defense classes." But then, Bianchi and Buono decided to take another couple of weeks off, it seems. Was the pressure beginning to get to them? There was no doubt that Kenneth Bianchi specifically really enjoyed the media and the notoriety that came along with the crimes. It's reported that Bianchi subscribed to the Times and read it back to front every single day, revelling in any information about his own crimes. He was never really the centre of attention. Nobody ever really paid much notice to him for his entire life, but now they were. It's said that whilst at work, he would overhear women talking about the crimes and would tease them, winking and saying, "You never know, he could be anyone. I could be the Hillside Strangler." There's no doubt he enjoyed it. The next murder wouldn't happen for a couple of weeks, with the body of 17-year-old Kimberly Martin being found on the 14th of December on a deserted lot near Los Angeles City Hall, on a steep hillside on Alvarado Street. Kimberly was a sex worker, but thanks to the recent murders, she'd been fearing for her safety, so she signed up for an escort agency, thinking that this would provide her with an extra layer of safety while she was out on the streets. Ironically, this seems to be the exact thing that led to her becoming the next victim. Bianchi and Buono made a call to her agency from a Hollywood public library payphone and asked for a pretty young girl, and Kimberly was the girl dispatched. Only when she arrived at the location that they had specified, it was an empty apartment. From there, she was abducted and tortured in the same way as the rest of the victims, taken to Buono's upholstery shop of horrors. And then, silence for 2 whole months. It seems that the Hillside Stranglers had moved on, until the body of their final victim was recovered on 17th of February 1978. 21-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth had been murdered the day before. She was a well-liked clerk who was saving up money to go to college, giving dance lessons on the side to help. She was a talented dancer and had won several contests. She was last seen in her apartment building on East Garfield Avenue and was probably headed to work at the Glendale Community College when she left. She worked nights there, answering the phone. At some point in her journey, she was attacked by the Stranglers, but nobody knew quite how or when. Cindy actually just so happened to live across the street from Christina Weckler, although the two didn't actually know each other. Which does beg the question, if Bianchi targeted Christina because she was his neighbour at one point, was it possible that Cindy had been too, or had Cindy just moved in after he left? Cindy's body was discovered somewhat by chance. Her body wasn't left at the side of a road or on an obvious hillside as so many of the other victims before her had been. Her body was hidden away, a huge unusual change in MO. A helicopter pilot in the area was flying over the Angeles Crest Highway and spotted an orange Datsun car abandoned halfway down a cliff. The pilot was concerned that somebody had crashed and gotten stuck and that there might be a driver in the car, so he called the police. Police responded to the scene and found that there was no one driving the car. It seemed abandoned. Only when they opened the boot, they discovered Cindy's nude body. Apart from this different placement of the body, everything else fitted with the MO of the Hillside Stranglers. The car had simply been pushed off the cliff by the perpetrators. It later transpired that Cindy had actually gone to Buono's upholstery shop that afternoon on her way to work to talk about work she needed doing on her car. Bianchi arrived whilst she was in the shop, and soon it was agreed between the two of them that she would be their next victim. Earlier that day, they tried to abduct a woman off the street, but there was a witness and they had to escape very quickly. Like the rest of these poor women, Cindy was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this would be the last murder the two cousins would participate in together. The reason that their joint crimes came to an end was probably twofold. One, because there had been a lot of witnesses to their crimes recently and that made them nervous. And two, because the two of them had a pretty bad falling out when Buono realised that his cousin still hadn't given up on his dreams of becoming a police officer. Throughout this entire killing spree, it turns out that Kenneth Bianchi was still applying for positions within the LAPD and had even worked his way into the inner fold, being taken out on ride-alongs. Some of those ride-alongs being for the Hillside Strangler investigations. Bianchi just thought he was well in there, that he was committing these crimes right under the police's nose. But he wasn't all that smart. Investigators are actually subtly questioning him on these journeys. He seemed way too interested. But Buono saw right through this and realised that investigators had probably been happy to accept Bianchi into the fold because they had sneaking suspicions about him as a suspect. Buono blew his lid. It was becoming very clear to him that his cousin was a liability. He was careless in a way that Buono absolutely was not, and he likely realised that they needed to stop, otherwise the police were going to come knocking sooner rather than later. Bianchi had also been getting into trouble with work around this point. He'd told his employer that he was undergoing cancer treatment and needed some time off, which was a big lie, and he was fired and then left unable to afford rent. He's forced to move out of his apartment and soon finds a new home and a new job that was nowhere near as well paid. Bianchi couldn't make the payments on his car and it was eventually repossessed. Also at this time, Bianchi's on-again, off-again girlfriend Kelly was heavily pregnant and actually gave birth to their child less than 1 week after the murder of Cindy. Kelly didn't want to raise a child in LA and decided that she was going to move north, back to her hometown in Bellingham, Washington, to raise their son. She invited Kenny to join her, of course, but originally he just wasn't interested in making the move. He had a new girlfriend called Cheryl and a new apartment with roommates, but it would be these two things that would prove to be the beginning of his undoing. Cheryl's mum actually called the police with suspicions that Bianchi was the strangler. I assume he was just a very odd guy who gave her a weird feeling. And his roommates found a police badge in their apartment, which raised concerns, and they also contacted the police. He was very much on investigators' radars, especially after the ride-alongs where they had questioned him about his involvement, but subtly. Angelo Buono had officially had enough. He threatened to kill Bianchi if he didn't leave LA immediately. He wasn't about to go to prison because of his cousin's carelessness, and as far as we're aware, this was the last of his serious crimes. Angelo Buono was now determined to stay under the radar. So in May 1978, Bianchi decides to join Kelly and his newborn son in Bellingham, Washington, where he soon finds a job working for a private security company once again. He also applied to the Whatcom County Sheriff's Reserve and does get offered a position there, so finally a position within the police. But if he did try and stay on the straight and narrow once in Bellingham, it didn't last very long, and not long after the new year of 1979, he was back to his old tricks. On January 11th, he lured two women, students at Western Washington University, into a house that he was guarding. They were 22-year-old Karen Mandick and 27-year-old Diane Wilder. As you can guess, there they were strangled and their bodies were subsequently hidden in an abandoned car in a heavily wooded area. Both Karen and Diane were noticed to be missing by the next day, January 12th. They were said to be incredibly responsible students, always showing up to work and class on time. Definitely not the type of people to take time off without telling anyone where they were going. When Karen didn't show up for work that day, her boss is extremely concerned and recalled that she had told him that she had accepted a house-sitting job in a very wealthy neighbourhood from a security guard friend of hers. The security guard in question? Kenneth Bianchi, of course. The Bellingham police got in touch with the security firm, who then called the security guard Kenneth to ask him if he knew anything of this supposed house-sitting job. He denied knowing anything, of course, and said he'd never even heard of Karen and Diane. He'd said that he'd been at a sheriff's meeting the night the women had disappeared and had nothing to do with it. But it didn't take long for investigators to find that Bianchi had not been at the Sheriff's Reserve meeting at all. So when contacted directly by the police, he said he'd skipped that meeting because it was on first aid, which he already knew. This wasn't a smart man. He's already contradicting his story entirely. I mean, as far as the police could have been concerned at this point, the women might have just gone off on a spontaneous holiday, but something told them that that just wasn't the case. The police chief, Terry Mangan, visited their home and found a very hungry cat, which was concerning in itself, and also found the address written down of where they were supposed to be house-sitting. A quick confirmation of the record showed that it was indeed Kenneth Bianchi who was in charge of looking after this house. Police also found that Bianchi had used a company truck the night the women disappeared and said that he was going to take it in for repair, but he never did. Concerned, the police chief asked all officers to be on the look for potential dump sites, saying this had to be considered a kidnapping and potential homicide. He also made an appeal to the public through the news, and soon after that, a woman called about a car that had been abandoned near her home in a heavily wooded area. Officers were sent to investigate this, and it didn't take them long to find the bodies of Diane and Karen inside the car, both strangled and bruised. The police chief wasted no time in picking up the security guard that night, Kenneth Bianchi. Interviewers found him charming, polite and intelligent, and his employer said that he was a fantastic employee. But the Bellingham police had a feeling that they just should not be letting this man go. After getting a warrant to search his house, they found stolen goods in his home, stolen from the homes that he was supposed to be guarding, which gave them a fantastic reason to keep him in their custody whilst forensic examinations of the crime scene were conducted. They found a number of hairs and fibres, including pubic hairs, where the bodies were found, and matched these hairs to hairs on the doorstep of the home they were supposed to be house sitting. But could these be linked back to Bianchi? With Bianchi in custody, Police Chief Mangan realised something that a lot of people may have actually missed out on. Knowing that Bianchi used to live in LA, he makes the connection to the Hillside Strangler. From what he could remember, the MO of Karen and Diane's murder was very similar to that of the Stranglers. He calls Sergeant Frank Salerno in Los Angeles, and from there, everything clicks into place. The addresses of victims Cindy, Christina and Kimberly all matched whereabouts Bianchi was living in LA at the time, and so Salerno heads to Bellingham himself to help with the investigation. Slowly, everything comes together and the evidence begins to mount up. The nail in the metaphorical coffin comes when jewellery was found in Bianchi's home, which matched the descriptions of jewellery worn by both Kimberly Martin and Yolanda Washington. Soon, there was no doubt about it. Kenneth Bianchi was the one responsible for the Hillside stranglings. But the big question was, did he act alone? A photo of Bianchi was released to the news media and it was announced that the strangler had finally been captured. Soon the LAPD received a phone call from a man called David Woods. He was a lawyer and had been the one to rescue Becky Spears and Sabra Hannon from their imprisonment by Bianchi and his cousin, Angelo Buono. If you recall back to earlier in the video, the cousins had acted as pimps for the two runaways before their killing spree began. Police also received a call from Angelo Buono's second wife, who told them of her ex-husband's violence, both physical and sexual. So off detectives go to have a chat with Angelo Buono. They knew before they even got there that this guy was likely to be the other half of the duo. They knew that two people were responsible for the crimes. Bianchi was still in jail at this point, and whilst he wasn't exactly the smartest killer to walk the earth, he definitely wasn't stupid. Whilst at first he denies any involvement in the murders, eventually he's appointed a lawyer called Dean Brett, and he convinces Brett that he was suffering from amnesia. He says he can't remember any of the killings, only bits and pieces. Concerned, a psychiatric social worker is called in who is fascinated by Bianchi. He was mild-mannered and considerate. How on earth could he be responsible for the murders of so many women? But soon Bianchi comes up with another idea. He starts saying that he's got multiple personalities. It was thought that he'd recently seen a movie called Sybil about somebody with multiple personalities, so he was feeling inspired, and it just so happened this would work great with an insanity defence. Although we have a much deeper understanding of so-called multiple personalities today, usually falling under the umbrella of DID or dissociative identity disorder, this was the late 70s and it wasn't as well understood. Bianchi said he had an evil personality who was called Steve, and it was Steve who was responsible for the murders. Kenny was completely innocent. The doctor even does diagnose him with multiple personalities, believing the story entirely. Perhaps he didn't want to believe that the same person could be responsible for such horrific crimes. The doctor entirely supported Bianchi's plan to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. But other doctors and the investigators found it quite clear that he was just faking the entire thing. Bianchi would often use the wrong pronouns and wrong tenses when referring to Steve, and so they got in another doctor, a leading name in hypnosis, to determine the truth, to which he proved that Bianchi was, of course, faking. The doctor even threw in a little trap for Bianchi, saying just off the cuff that people with multiple personalities usually have more than two personalities. So immediately Bianchi starts saying, of course he has a third, Benny. It was all a lie, obviously. In questioning, Buono also said he was completely innocent. Investigators presented an undeniable amount of circumstantial evidence to him, but he never broke, not for a second. At some point, Salerno had presented a photo lineup to Marcus Camden, the man who'd seen Judy Miller get into a car on the night she died, and he immediately picked out Buono from the lineup, but he didn't recognise Bianchi. But sadly, this wasn't the most reliable of evidence, as Marcus had recently checked himself into hospital for depression, something which investigators knew the defence would use to discredit him as a witness almost immediately. Seeing as there was no actual evidence to link Buono to the crimes, investigators had to make a decision what to do. They'd of course search his home and upholstery shop looking for any clues, but this man was meticulously clean. He left nothing incriminating behind. But they couldn't let this clearly dangerous man out to freely wander the streets, so instead Bianchi is offered a deal. The death penalty had very much been on the table for Bianchi, which he clearly didn't want. Investigators tell Bianchi that if he pled guilty and testified against Angelo Buono in court, they would take the death penalty off the table completely, and instead he would receive concurrent life sentences and be eligible for parole. He'd also be able to serve his time in California, where the prisons were much nicer than Washington. It was quite clear that he was going to be found guilty no matter what. This multiple personalities defence just wasn't going to stand up in court, so Bianchi agrees to testify truthfully and fully against his cousin. It wasn't much of a choice for him either. He was either going to live or he was going to die, and he chose to live. It was only really at this point that Bianchi started to open up about the crimes, saying how they used to pretend to be police officers, how they had fake badges. He said the sex workers were easy to get into the cars, whereas the nice girls, as he called them, required a bit more manipulation. A huge turning point in the whole case is when Salerno asked Bianchi what type of material was used to blindfold the girls once they were at the upholstery shop, specifically what was used to blindfold Judy Miller. If you remember, Salerno had found a tiny piece of fluff on her eyelid, which had been held as forensic evidence. When Bianchi replies that Buono used foam that he had in the shop, they finally had some evidence to link the two. Bianchi finally cracked after this point and described each murder in detail. Turns out, he could remember it all perfectly. Not long after his arrest, Bianchi receives a letter in prison from a woman called Veronica Compton, who wanted to ask for his opinion on her play about a serial killer. She was just one of these women who wrote to serial killers in prison, wanting to be romantically involved with them, which honestly doesn't ever get less weird. Over the next few months, their correspondence continues, and together they come up with a plan to exonerate Bianchi so they could be together properly. She said that she would travel to Bellingham and kill a woman with the Stranglers' MO and place his semen at the scene, proving that the Strangler was still very much on the loose and investigators had the wrong guy. In September 1980, Veronica visits Bianchi in prison and, in some way that I don't want to think about too much, receives his semen. She flies to Bellingham and selects her target, a 26-year-old woman called Kim Breed, who she meets in a Bellingham tavern. They hang out for a bit, and eventually Veronica invites Kim to join her in her room at a local Shangri-La motel. Once there, Veronica attempts to bind and kill Kim, but luckily Kim manages to escape and soon alerts a friend. Compton immediately fled herself and took a flight to San Francisco, but upon arrival she was said to be hysterical. She sent a letter and a tape to the Bellingham police claiming that Bianchi was innocent and pointed out that the murder attempt was proof that the real Hillside Strangler was still on the loose. Yeah, it was a very sloppy plan. I don't know how she thought any of that would work. Of course, she was soon arrested and convicted herself of attempted murder and was sentenced to prison with no chance of parole until 1994. She soon moves on from Bianchi and finds herself in love with another serial killer instead and was released from prison in 2003, and she hasn't been heard from since. Seeing as Bianchi pled guilty, there wasn't a trial for him. He agreed to admit to 5 of the murders, those of Yolanda Washington, Jane King, Kimberly Martin, Christina Weckler, and Cindy Hudspeth. He also pled guilty to 1 count of kidnapping, rape and sodomy, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder in exchange for testimony against his cousin. The judge sentenced Bianchi to 6 terms of life imprisonment, saying, "I wish I had the power that it be ordered that your sentence be ordered to run consecutively." Under California law, he could have been eligible for parole within 7 years, but I am pleased to report that he is still very much in prison today, 30 years later. The week previously in Washington, he admitted to killing 2 women there and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. However, despite the terms of his agreement, when it actually came round to giving testimony against his cousin, he made it as complicated as possible. Throughout the months, Bianchi had swayed back and forth to putting full blame of his cousin, saying that he acted alone and protesting both of their innocence. In July 1981, at the preliminary hearing for Buono, Bianchi testifies that he doesn't know if he was telling the truth or not when he told the police of his cousin's involvement. This was completely unexpected testimony, and I can imagine Buono's defence lawyers were overjoyed because they immediately moved to dismiss all 10 counts of murder against him and to drop prosecution against him as the Hillside Strangler. Luckily, the judge denied that motion, saying a dismissal would not be in the furtherance of justice. Luckily, by this point, prosecutors had been able to come up with enough damning evidence to prove Buono's involvement anyway. The fibres found on Judy Miller's eyelid and Lauren Wagner's hand were proven to have come from Buono's house and upholstery shop. Animal hairs stuck to Lauren's hands came from his rabbit. The imprint of a police badge was found on his wallet, along with puncture marks showing that it had been pinned in there. 2 separate people positively identified him in a lineup. After the case wasn't dismissed, the DA's office actually withdrew from the case, and the Attorney General ended up bringing in 2 new prosecutors who decided that there was enough evidence to prosecute, luckily. So the case goes to trial in November 1981, but was immediately disrupted by all sorts of motions from the defence and a very slow jury selection process, so it didn't start properly until the spring of 1982. Both Becky Spears and Sabra Hannon stood up as witnesses testifying to Buono's sadism. Bianchi came up to testify again, but he really wasn't cooperating until the judge reminded him that if he violated his plea bargain agreement, then he would be sent back to the awful Walla Walla prison in Washington, and he very quickly got his shit together. Magically, he started talking, but his testimony still wasn't the most reliable. This would turn out to be the longest trial in California's history at the time, lasting more than 2 years with more than 1,000 exhibits and 250 witnesses. The nail in his coffin came when a woman came forward saying that Buono had terrorised her in the Hollywood Library on the same night that the phone call was made to the escort agency, the phone call which eventually led to the death of Kimberly Martin. The payphone that call was made from was at the library. Members of the jury were taken to the actual hillside where the victims were found and were given presentations by detectives at each site. Meanwhile, Buono is refusing to cooperate with his defence attorneys, so there's not too much they can do in terms of a defence. Eventually, on October 21st, 1983, the jury begins deliberations, and it wasn't an easy one. They weren't in agreement. Eventually, 10 days later, on the 31st of October, they come to an agreement that he was guilty of the murder of Lauren Wagner. 3 days later, he's found not guilty of the murder of Yolanda Washington. Over the coming days, he's found guilty of the murders of Judy Miller, Dolores Cepeda, Sonia Johnson, Kimberly Martin, Christina Weckler, Lissa Caston, Jane King, and Cindy Hudspeth. With this many murder convictions, he's found to be a multiple murderer under California law and automatically faces either life in prison or the death penalty. He claims that his morals and constitutional rights have been broken. At sentencing, the jury deliberate for an hour, eventually recommending life in prison without the possibility of parole and spare him of the death penalty. Buono spent the rest of his life in prison, dying at Calipatria State Prison from a heart condition in September 2002, aged 67 years old. Kenneth Bianchi, as I said, remains in prison today. Ironically, he was actually eventually transferred to Walla Walla Prison in Washington, despite his testimony, so justice is sweet. As interested as people are in learning about serial killers, figuring out what goes on in their heads, what leads them to commit the horrific crimes that they do, they're never the most important people in these stories. The most important people, the faces and names to remember, are the victims. Yolanda Washington, Judy Miller, Lissa Caston, Jane King, Dolly Cepeda, Sonia Johnson, Christina Weckler, Lauren Wagner, Kimberly Martin, Cindy Hudspeth, Karen Mandick, and Diane Wilder. Each of these women lived full lives of their own before their paths crossed with Kenneth Bianchi's and Angelo Buono's. They had loved ones, they had hobbies, personalities, favourite foods and pet peeves. They're not just names in the story, and they will matter more than the killers ever will. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.